Sam I was the only child in the family born in Silesia. I have attended school, and shortly before the war, the Polish government found it necessary to remove some of the higher paying tax bracket people from the border zone, which was within 4 kilometers of the German border. We have moved to Krakow, and we resided there for several months prior to the outbreak of the war. As soon as the war broke out and the Germans flooded the borders of Poland, we have decided, or my parents have decided, to run in the same direction as the Polish military did, which was going east. We have traveled for about a week until we wound up at the border of Romania, or near the border of Romania and Poland, and have visited or made a stop with my mother's cousin, who was at that time the Rebbitzin of Chortkov, which is the rabbi's wife of the city of Chortkov. About that time, Poland became completely taken by the Germans, and from the eastern borders of Poland, the Russians marched in and occupied 1/3 approximately of the eastern part of Poland. And the division line was just west of Lvov, which is one of the major cities in Poland, and we have wound up with the Russians at that particular time. My mother's sisters, Bella Spiegler and Cesia Brihant, Nee Schall, as well as Rosalia Raja Schall, were all on the German side of the divided Poland. Mother felt that by remaining on the Russian-occupied side, she would be divided, or would be apart from her sisters, and most of all our worldly goods and possessions were on the other side, which would have helped in maintaining us alive, since on the Russian side we had almost no relatives. And we decided then, or my parents did, that we shall return to the German side of the occupied Poland. I must add that at that time, the worst that we heard, that the Germans make some of the younger Jews work at different jobs within the surrounding areas of the towns and villages where they lived. The crossing of the border was done almost legitimately. The Russians didn't object. The Russians didn't object of anyone who wanted to cross from village to village. But as we found out shortly after, the people who were under the German occupation, be it Poles or Ukrainians, have taken advantage, especially when they found that in the group there were some Jews. Shortly after we crossed through a little creek guided by some people who supposedly were paid for taking us over safely, and who left us pointing to go to the village to our right, a group of people showed up, including some people that looked official Polish police. We later found out that they were just part of uniforms from the Polish army, who have surrounded us, and in our group there may have been 10 or 11 people, among them myself and my mother. They have demanded that we give them all valuables, but did not search us. But at one point somebody walked up to me. I was then of bar mitzvah age, and noticed that I'm wearing a wool coat with a piece of fur as a collar, and they pulled it off me by saying, "You're not allowed to bring this type of thing into the country." And we heard in Polish, one fellow spoke to the other, "That would fit my Jasiek," which is a Polish name for a boy. That was the greeting we had on the German side of the Polish-occupied Poland, and we made our way into the village. We were left by those people, and we were not harassed until we got into the center of this little village, where my mother was able to find a horse and buggy with some hay on it that took us into a town called Zamość. In Zamość we found a few Jews living in this small town as they have before. However, we found that they have to wear bands which were white with blue Magen Davids on them, and they have pointed out to us that the only way we can get to the destination we tried to get to would be taking a train. And so we bought tickets and got on the train, and we hid our newly acquired armbands by putting a jacket or a sweater over it, and in that fashion we got on the train. Our journey took us through the city of Lublin, and at that point the train had to stop, and they rerouted it. As a matter of fact, this was the wrong train to begin with, but we were told in Lublin we would get the proper train to go to Krakow. And when the train was rerouted, we were all taken off the train, regardless of who was there, and lined up in a row of people, four abreast, and told that soon there'll be another train coming. Well, while at the station, we decided we better not hide any longer our bands, because that carried the penalty of death. And so Mother and myself walked away from that group and uncovered our bands. It took only a few minutes. We were spotted and chased over to a bunch of people who were wearing the same type of band, but they were segregated from the rest of the would-be travelers on the train station. We waited there for quite a long time. Well, suddenly, and that is a picture I shall never forget to my dying days, from a side door came jumping out two Germans, quite in a hurry, dressed in military uniform and covered by white coats resembling doctor's coats, with huge knives in their hands, and in German. By the way, I was very versed in German, since I have spoken German up to the age of 7. It was the only language I knew, and my mother and myself were fluent in that language, and we understood and they came out saying, we need double the number of the Jews because we'll never get finished. And then they turned around with a grin on their face and said, any volunteers? Well, at that point, Mother squeezed my hand and held me tight because that sounded like our end, seeing these two with the knives coming out with the white coats, spotted with blood all over. We felt that we've come to the end of our journeys. We later found out that these Germans have killed a load of geese and chickens for the military personnel in Lublin. At that point, they have unloaded from the station these chickens and geese, and instead of transporting them further alive, they decided in one of the halls of the railroad station to have them killed and picked. And since labor was free, it was the most unique idea of getting both free labor and clean birds for further processing. But I can only remember this as being the first shock of being confronted with death in a sadistic way that has since then been repeated quite a few times, but was very shocking to a young boy who has just left what he considered a safe haven into the hands of these German monsters. We were not selected, we didn't volunteer, we were not selected at that incident, and as I stated, we wound up going into the city of Lublin, and finally from there we did get through small little Jewish towns from town to town by horse and buggy and partly by walking to the outskirts of the city of Wolbrum, which was just north of Krakow, where our prime aim was to get to. We have had some relatives, a sister-in-law to my Aunt Bella, who was a Spiegler by marriage, and whose family of Spieglers resided in Wolbrum. We went into the city of Wolbrum and have, since that particular day that we got there, decided to stay in Wolbrum and not to come into Krakow. We were told that there is a possibility of a ghetto being formed in Krakow, and Wolbrum was relatively quiet. And the few incidents that were reported of some Jews getting beaten up or forced to work, removing garbage and laying some stones on a road, it was relatively considered to be quiet. So I stayed with my mother in the town of Wolbrum for a little while until my uncle from Krakow came with his wife, their daughter, and my father to Wolbrum. We resided in Wolbrum in a one-room accommodation, my father, my mother, and myself. We were fortunate enough that my father has been able to bring with him some valuables that were traded off slowly, but provided us with the daily sustenance and even more. My mother insisted that while the war may take a while, the end will be that one day I'll need the English language. And so 3 or 4 of us who were able to afford to sustain a professor of the Hebrew University from Krakow, who was quite fluent in English and was a professor of mathematics, has gathered the 4 of us in an attic of one of the local people, which was considered quite safe, and taught us a bit of geography, a lot of mathematics, and a bit of English. Thanks to the foresight of my mother and the ability of the professor to put some of it through, I have learned the basic English that I now speak. For a while it was relatively good, especially for me. Being the only child, I was well provided for and protected from any work or being caught by the local Jewish or Polish police to be made to work. There was also no particular ghetto, since the majority of the inhabitants of Walbrom was Jewish. And we resided at a house owned by the house of the local midwife. And we were quite safe there, although I remember that when it came to the time the proclamation was made that all Jews have to assemble the next day in a gathering place, which was the center of the little town, we felt it was safer just before being gathered the night before. We felt it was safer to stay in the Jewish section or in a house where there were only Jews, because it could happen, being in a house where the ownership was, as I stated, the midwife, was Christian ownership, that someone may get the idea it would be the right time to rob or even kill us. Therefore, we have opened the wooden floors of that one room, and we have hidden in there the bit of silverware that my father brought from Krakow and some of the valuables of the family. It was on about 3 boards that my father lifted and hand dug with some small kitchen utensil the earth beneath it. And among other things, there was some fur jacket of my mother, and all that was wrapped in some rags and buried under the floor, just in case we ever get the chance to ever need it. We have then moved into a home of a Jewish baker in which my aunt was living with her family. And it was that night that my parents, unbeknown to me, decided that myself, my mother, my aunt, and their daughter would hide out in the attic, which was very well suitable for that, since the only entrance to that attic was from the outside on top of the roof. It was extremely dangerous to get in, but once in there, it was Well, I would say the size of 2 clothes closets. And the reason that was decided upon is that the owners, the old folks, the father and mother of the owners, were too old to be expected to march in the morning from the gathering point to the railroad station. And so they would be left there with some food, and at a later point they could come out possibly and see any of the Polacks or the Polish neighbors that would possibly sustain them, since they've been all their lives in that town and were very well liked by the population there. Basically, we were chosen to accompany these old folks because they couldn't possibly make it in or out of that hiding place on top of the roof. And so it was decided that the 2 wives and their kids, meaning me and my cousin Ada, and her mother and my mother, would accompany these older folks. They were in their 60s, possibly 70s. We then were we awakened in the morning at about sunrise, and we were told to hurry up, gather a few things and clothing, and follow on the stepladder up to the roof. And we were then told why we're going there. We've hidden, the roof was closed from the outside, and it became dark and silent for, it sounded like an eternity to me, and I imagined to everyone in there. There was only a few whispers between our mothers and between us regarding a drink of water or a bite of bread. The old folks were silent throughout this eternity. Suddenly, which had to be shortly after noon the following day, we heard shots in different places coming from right and left, sporadic, not very many, but we knew there were shots. And then, within a few hours after that, we heard a Jewish man, or we presume to be Jewish, saying to us, Mr. and Mrs., I do not recall their name, but that was the name of the older folks that were hidden with us. And then my mother's name, as well as my aunt's name, was called, announcing that I am the police chief, the Jewish police chief, and I hereby request that you come out of the roof hiding, since we are sent here by your husbands, and I have safe escort for you to take you to them, meaning my father and my uncle. The name of this man was familiar to me and to my mother, since he was from our hometown where I was born, in Silesia, Chorzów, Królewska Huta. He was the local painter and a very poor man whom my father has numerous times given help financially and in clothing and in other ways. And he was indebted to my father and my mother, and we knew that he wouldn't lie. So we opened this hiding place, and sure enough, my mother looked down and she saw this man, this police chief, who was accompanied with 2 German soldiers, and he waved at my mother, stating, it's all right, come on down, Mrs. Geyer. We have followed my mother down the step ladder, but as we were hitting the bottom of the step ladder, each one of us got hit with a whip. My mother tried to cover me from getting hit. She partially succeeded, but we were scared. It didn't hurt, because we realized that although the police chief's intentions may have been quite honorable at that particular time, we realized that the upper hand was with the Germans. And it unfortunately proven itself within minutes of us leaving the hiding place. We were jostled and pushed and ordered to get going, los, forwards. We marched through the small exit from the courtyard of that particular house, and the older folks, being slower, were the last ones to leave the courtyard. We heard 2 shots ring out behind us, and we didn't look around. We knew what it was. We have never seen these old folks again after leaving that house. We were chased for approximately 2 to 3 kilometers down a country road to the railroad station of Walbrum. It was a small railroad siding with about 2 or 3 railroad tracks, and just beyond them there was a bit of a field with gravel or sand. We were there reunited with our father and uncle, and for a few hours that night we were very happy we were together. But as soon as the sun rose, we were ordered to stand up in rows, and what was the preparation to the final selection. The selection was done by 3 Germans, including 1 officer, who walked among us and made motions. The men, adult men, and young fellows who looked healthy were segregated from the women, children, and older folks. They were picked out, so to speak, and there were several columns of these men. By about 10 or 11, just before noon, the selection was done. And this is another episode in my life. At that stage, it was quite clear, at least to my mother, it was clear that the group selected was having some chance of staying alive, and she done the most heroic thing that I can imagine a mother could do. Being fluent in German, she jumped out of the non-segregated group of people, such as women and children and older people, and ran right almost in front of the German officer, proclaiming in German, "This fellow here, he ran from the other side over," and pointing at me. She was almost knocked down by the soldiers that were just next to the German officer, but the German officer somehow or other was impressed, whether with the courage of this woman or with the fact that one Jew is pointing out another. I was just past bar mitzvah, but I was tall enough and looking well enough possibly to be selected among the working group, and he just turned around and smacked me with the whip and says, "Get over there," in German, "Los." And I didn't want to. But people pushed me, including my mother, and I was afraid to get another whip. I ran over to my father and uncle who were watching all this from the other side, from the group that was selected. And my father embraced me and said, "It's going to be all right, it's going to be all right." That's the last time I saw my mother. We were taken to a camp near Krakow. We arrived there in the dark. We were sitting in the fields just outside the camp. From time to time, we heard a sadist who has kicked in human brains with his boots, not only shot them but kicked them in, and I cleaned human brains from his well-polished boots. And because of having this privilege of working for this monster, I was able to obtain a piece of paper to go back and get some of my clothing, supposedly well hidden in Volbrum, the little town that I told him I come from, and I would need to get there with a permit. And somehow he felt that I was valuable enough to him to give me this paper, which was only good for 3 days, and signed by him. Unbeknown to me, actually, it was a useless paper because it did not carry any seal of any authority. But to us, anything a German did was almost like a commandment. And so I took this piece of paper and showed it to my father, who in turn said, "Well, it doesn't say your first name or anything, it just says Jude and your last name, and it doesn't indicate whether there's one of us or two of us." And we walked with that piece of paper through the front gate, and the Jewish police, as well as the Germans, felt that that was an official enough document, since it had his signature on the bottom, and didn't question how many. And so the two of us got out of the Ulac 1 and got onto a horse and buggy that was at the outskirts of Krakow, and they were looking for passengers to take to villages. For a small fee, they would let you sit in the back of the hay wagon and travel with them. Several hours of that journey took us back to Volbrum. We have then discovered that the Germans, in order to clear all the possessions of the Jewish homes, have saved a small group of local workers from the day that we were evicted and transported out of Volbrum. There was the Jewish police and a few selected people, numbering in a couple of dozen, who were supposedly clearing all the valuables and the belongings of the Jewish homes. And it was quite a task, since there was possibly 10 or 12,000 Jews living in Volbrum before the war. We have met up with this police chief who has done my father a favor and has brought me and my mother out of hiding. And he arranged again for us to have a place to stay, since he felt he was obligated to Meyer Geyer, which was the name by which my father went in the city of Königsegg. We stayed 3 days, as long as the permit permitted. And then my father said,
to come out of hell, such as the work camp Ulak 1 was, where daily the Ukrainian Sonderdienst were shooting people just for target practice. He felt that to go back there would be wrong. We should stay as long as we can, and since we have the cooperation of this Jewish police chief, we should stay here. His name comes back to me now. His name was Marger. So long as Marger is in town, there won't be any harm coming to us. Well, we stayed another few days, and then all of a sudden, one evening, Marger came over to the room we stayed in and notified us that tomorrow he and everyone else will be taken away, hopefully to a work camp. My father there decided that it was the wrong move to go with the police, since they were all healthy-looking individuals. He feared that I may be discovered, that I shouldn't have been in that group, and therefore his idea was to hide. And we did. The following night, we were hidden in the cupboard or a closet of the old synagogue, which was still standing, wasn't burned down. And we knew that that day everybody was evicted, taken away, and the night to follow we heard shots, knowing that they are searching. My father had then made the next decision to leave before dawn to Krakow, to the ghetto, which was populated with thousands of Jews, and he felt where there's thousands of Jews, there must be some safety. And we did. We walked through half the night to the very early morning hours to a small village called Słomniki, that's somewhere halfway between Wolbrum and Krakow. And in Słomniki I couldn't move anymore because I wasn't used to walk miles and miles. My father supported me, but finally has made up his mind and my mind that we have to rest. And so he took a chance of leaving me in the bushes and walking to the first farmhouse he has seen. And upon 5 to 10 minutes, which sounded to me like an eternity, he came back with a Polish fellow in his late 20s. And he said in Polish, "Give me that boy, I'll carry him. He looks like he can't walk." But I resisted. I said, "Oh, no, I'm fine. I'm going to walk." We walked to the rear of the barn, climbed up a stepladder, wound up in a bed of hay, and I fell asleep. It must have been maybe noon when I heard quite loud conversation at the bottom of this stepladder on which we climbed into this barn. And it was in Polish. And this is the only time that I have seen and heard two Poles, a son and father, arguing about the danger of hiding a Jew. Most of the time I heard is they all agreed the Jews were not a necessary human race and that they should have been wiped out. But here was a man whom I have tried to find since but was unable. He was a righteous Pole. His family name was Wilczyk from Słomniki. At that point that I'm describing, the father has pointed out to his son in Polish whether he is crazy, whether he realizes that finding Jews hidden in their barn would mean the death penalty. And there was a reaction to it by the son telling his father he's an old fool to mind his own business. He's responsible and no one else, and he'll be answerable if anything should go wrong. But his father insisted and made it louder and louder. His son warned him to keep it down, to keep it quiet. He don't want anyone to hear it. His father became louder, and all of a sudden, to my amazement, the son has slapped his father strong enough that we could hear it up in the loft in the straw, and that quietened him down, and he moved from the door of the barn to his home. That night, I gather my father has paid for it with some valuables and possibly some money he had. Mr. Vilchik has taken a horse and a hay wagon with some produce so that it would look that he's going to market to Krakow, and has put us on the wagon, and we started the journey to the ghetto. At the gate of the ghetto, the Polish man has advised my father how to put in our documents some money, I presume it to be a $10 bill, and go see the Polish police, which was the first guard on the outside of the ghetto. And he also told my father not to worry about the Jewish police. Once we pass the Polish police, they'll have no choice but to let us in. And that is the last time I heard of seeing of Vilchik. Quite right he was. After handing the passport with a bill in the crease of the passport, the Polish policeman removed the money, didn't even look at the passport, ordered us to run, and we run into the Jewish posts at the gates of the ghetto of Krakow. The story of the ghetto was a brief one. We've met people who were worse off. At least I thought they were. My father was able to find work because there was a necessity to be able to earn a provision card for some food in a brush making factory owned and operated by a large family known as the Zaltz brothers. And that is where I found someone who, thank God, is still alive and resides with us today in Toronto. My father gathered them to our little accommodation, which consisted of a folded straw bed and a floor bed. That individual has had no one there. He was alone. This individual's name is Alex Eisen of Toronto today, but originally born in Krakow. We have had slept together in this accommodation, and we stayed together for months until such time that the ghetto start being sent partially to Ulak 2, that means work camp number 2, which was opposite to the Ulak 1, where I originally was transported from Walbrum. Being part of the Birstenbinderei, which is the factory, as I mentioned, owned and operated by the Zaltz family, we produced brushes, and Ulak 2 was meant to house people who were essential to the production of items that may be helpful in the war effort, such as brushes for the military. We were transferred, one of the first groups, to Krakow Plaszow number 2, and we worked during the day in the barrack that was converted into a plant, if you want to call it that. There were 5 electric motors on which holes were drilled for the brushes, and the remainder of that barrack was divided into tables and benches on which mostly women, but some men, were threading the straws and some bristles into the drilled boards to create a polished brush or a sweeping brush, and they were lined up with benches and tables throughout that huge room. At the head of the room, just beneath the windows, there was 5 motors, as I mentioned, with more gifted and more talented young people who knew how to drill single holes in a brush that usually consisted of over 100 holes in a symmetric way, so that the brush would look like a brush when threaded with the material. I was one of the 5. I was able to more or less be privileged by having additional maybe bread, because we were essential in providing these much needed boards with the holes in them, so that the rest of the people had what to do in order not to expose them sitting idle, because if that ever occurred, they would be possibly dismissed, taken away, or shot. And I have witnessed an incident that I'd like to describe, what could have happened if someone was sitting idle. As I stated, there was men and women sitting at the same benches in some cases. And one night we were working 2 shifts. One night I happened to be on the night shift, and at one of the tables it occurred that there was a shortage of material. It wasn't the boards, it was cut horse hair that was short, and they were waiting for the hair to be cut just about 2-3 meters away. And a woman turned around and spoke to a man across the table, asking him about something. And there was a bit of a laughter between them. And while the laughter hasn't stopped yet, behind me, a window busted and a burst of 2 shots fired through it laid the man dead and the woman gravely wounded. It was one of the Germans, not Miller this time, but one of his other henchmen, that was patrolling the working parts of Plaszow 2, and he evidently stood in that window and saw the talk that occurred between this woman and the man across the table. And that is an episode that is very vivid in my eyes. There were other episodes, one of which I would like to mention to explain the enormity of the situation that was daily occurrences in Plaszow. A group of people were searched at the gate coming back from a job in the railroad yards, loading lumber or whatever. At the end of the day, they would be brought back, and there was a routine search that was usually at random by one of the Ukrainian Wachmeisters, who would point a finger, strip a man, see if he had anything, or a woman. Most of these groups were consisting of men, though. And one day, a group was searched, and between 3 people, a loaf of bread divided into 3 sections was found, and the whole group, some 36 or 38 people, were marched on the mountain, which was a leftover of a crater in which Krakow was at one time disposing some of their garbage or whatever, and there was a huge crater, and we called it the Mount. And they were taken up to the Mount, and the Ukrainian group with a machine gun was erected, and wave after wave, these people were running naked, undressed, towards the edge of that huge grave and shot. It wasn't unusual except what happened after that. We were again at the night shift, and this was in the late afternoon when they were caught with this bread. They were executed just before sundown, and as they were executed, it got very cloudy and dark, and they left the Mount. The Ukrainians usually took precautions of looking down, and if they saw anybody moving, they would shoot him with another burst of fire, but this time it was very brief. I heard them only shoot after the execution, maybe once or twice, and I left the Mount because it did start to rain. Well, about an hour after the storm developed really into a deluge, it was pouring, and there was constantly thunder, and all of a sudden the sky broke with a huge bolt of light, and the storm got so intense that the doors and the windows in the barrack where we were working at the time, which by the way was one of the first barracks facing that Mount with the grave in it, suddenly the door sprung open, and in that huge bolt of light I saw something that still gives me the shivers when I think of it. There was a creature with spread arms into the skies, storming through the door. At first I thought it was the storm, and then we realized that it wasn't just a storm, there was somebody coming through the door. What I omitted to say in my excitement, that during the storm, the lights that were necessary for us to do the drilling and to see what the people with the brushes in their hand were doing, that light was out. We were used to it when there was ever an alarm or some failure of some sort in the electrical works in the city of Krakow. We were told to sit tight in the chairs, wherever we were doing, and wait till the lights came back on. Well, this time we thought it was the storm that cut out the electricity. And while we were sitting in the total dark, this occurrence with a bolt of light, and that being coming through that door with well-lit, it was a naked man who was shot through the shoulder, but barely shot. He was knocked out by the sheer fall down into the pit, and other bodies covering him. As we later found out, he lay there unconscious for a while, and when he came to, he was wet and cold, and he realized he was buried among the dead. He dug through 2 or 3 of the bodies and emerged on top. And the first barrack he saw was ours. In the thunder and in the lightning, he noticed that there is a barrack, and half aware what he was doing, he came running through that door. We were able to, with the help of the Zaltz brothers, who had free access to both halves of the camp since they were running not one but two of the brush factories. And we were able to get one of the counting officers to miscount by one, and we were able the next day at the shift changes to smuggle this wounded individual into the barracks where we were living in. I have never seen this man's face since it was all hidden from the majority of the people in the working barrack, so that there wouldn't be any talk about it. But I was told by my father that he was smuggled into the living quarters. I have never known his face, I have never heard his name, and I don't know whether he has survived or not. But there was one of the incidents that will haunt me forever. We were eventually shipped from Plaszow to what is known as a legitimate concentration camp. We were shipped to Gross-Rosen in Germany proper. But evidently, because it was getting tougher and tougher for the Germans in the Eastern Front, and they were trying to get rid of, by all means, whether it was by extinction in crematorias or by shipping the majority inland to Germany, which they hoped would never be taken. We were shipped to Gross-Rosen, and from Gross-Rosen we were shipped to a satellite camp which was run by the TOT organization, which was a group of military divisions of bridge builders, road builders, and so on. The place, the satellite camp, was called Wolfsburg, near Falkenberg. I imagine that is somewhere in Silesia, on the German side. Again here, due to working in swampy terrain, cutting out what was then called torf. I don't really know what the proper... I think it could be peat moss, but it was dried and used instead of coal and wood to fire and wood-burning stoves. I imagine because they were getting short in resources, they found this to be a substitute. And we were sitting and standing in swamps until one day I was unable to stand up and collapsed. I assume now, since I'm a little more knowledgeable, it was the beginning of my arthritis. And my father carried me back to camp on the orders of the Wachmann, the Schutzmann, that is the Wehrmacht, not the SS, but Wehrmacht, that was supervising the TOT organization undertakings. And he carried me a couple of kilometers back to camp. And the reason I bring this episode is this was a case where a Jewish doctor named Price, to the best of my knowledge, I tried to search for him, but to the best of my knowledge he didn't survive. He was from Lodz. He was a medical doctor who has sustained me, although it was very, very dangerous to keep anybody longer than 2-3 days in the hospital or ambulance barrack, which consisted of 6 or 8 bunks, two on top of each other, and a very small corner where he had a clean sheet, some tweezers, and some minor scalpel, just a gauze band-aids, few minor things, but he was able to maintain and help as he did for me. He took a risk of maintaining me for several weeks through what he called polioarthritis acuta, which I think translates into an acute arthritic incident. His way of helping me was having a few bricks that he had some work people who were in the barracks put on the stove, which was fired by torf or by wood, made it red hot, and by wrapping it into a rag, would apply primarily to my feet, which are still scarred from the burns that I received, but definitely helped me to get back on my feet. And this I remember as being saved once again, but this time by a Jewish doctor who took a chance during a interview with a medical doctor sent from Auschwitz to check on the conditions. And when questioned, what are these people doing here, he explained this one had a sliver and had to be cut open, this one had a severe fall and has to have his muscle regain strength. And when it came to me, he just simply said that I had a severe cold and escaped pleurisy, and I'll be back to work in a couple of days.